Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Local Dive podcast, deep and shallow musings on Christ, the church, and culture. I'm one of your hosts, Ashlyn Portero, here with Alex Scott and Dean and Sarah. How are you guys doing?
Hey. Hello, good to be back.
All right. Well, before we jump in, we just want to thank everybody for listening. If you'd like to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, you can do that, and also follow us on social media at the Local Dive Pod and stay engaged that way. But today we're going to jump into episode 7, where we'll be talking about, in our deep dive, challenges and opportunities of what we're calling the teenage church, growing sort of out of the church plant and not quite at the established big boy church, I guess. So, but before we get there, we're going to wade into the shallow end. And because we're kind of talking about the awkwardness of growing up as a church, we're going to talk about the awkwardness of growing up as a human. And so we're going to be diving into the awkward middle school teenage years.
Everybody get your Axe body spray ready.
Ooh, sit in a cloud.
Oh, I'm ready to tuck in my shirt to my duck head shorts so you can see the tag that says duck head as we walk down the hall, and ready to go.
All right.
Sweet.
Okay, so first question for you guys. What were, just kind of set the stage here, what were some of your favorite things in middle school that like were uniquely you in middle school? What did you like?
Are you in deep thought there?
Yeah, I was not ready for that one.
Alex has repressed everything.
I loved middle school because I had a great group of friends. And we all played baseball together, all lived in the same neighborhood, like all came up together.
That's
we were
fun.
good friends in high school too. So it was a lot of fun for me. So I think the thing that was probably the most me in middle school was sports with my friends. And another thing, my dad was my principal.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm a PK of the other kind, which actually was a lot of fun. It had its negative things, but never from him. Just from other people. He was like totally cool about it.
Yeah.
And all my friends loved him too, because my dad's just great. But like teachers would, I could get away with anything. At the same time, I couldn't get away with anything, if that makes sense. Like I had favoritism shown towards me, but if anything happened, they would tell my dad.
Yeah.
Like one time, my friends and I decided we didn't want to go to school. It was we all would walk together up Copperfield Circle across Deer Lake Road to Deer Lake Middle School, and we all would meet at my house. And one morning we just decided we wanted to stay and play video games and just not go to school. So we just weren't going to go. And within like 15 minutes after the bell rang to our plan, I don't know why I thought we could get away with this. Or maybe we're going to go late, I think. We're going
When
to
you're 12, you think you can do anything.
yeah. I mean, we're just going to go late, like after lunch or something. We just weren't going to go in the morning for sure. We were going to play video games, have like a little tournament. My dad comes pulling down the road and pulls in the driveway. Because my homeroom teacher called him and said, "Hey, where's Dean? Is he sick or whatever?" in his office, and he was like, "Nope."
I'll be right back.
And he's like, "Everybody get in the car." So all my friends run and pile in the car, and he drives us all up to school.
Hopefully, he at least gave you like a late pass, so you got into class without
I don't even
a
remember.
penalty. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I liked middle school. It was fun. I went to a different middle school than most of my friends from elementary school. And so I made a whole new group of friends and had a good time. So I don't really have bad memories. At similar situation, my mom had taught at the school that I went to, so most of the teachers who were still there and that I ended up having were very similar. It was like, Alex hasn't turned in his homework for 3 days, just FYI. And then I'd come home and it's like, you have to sit down and do all your math homework before you can go outside. And I was just like, Can I just be a normal kid? Can I get a C once? So
Can I just have parents who don't care?
Yeah.
My dad would say, "No, you cannot, because C's are average, and you're an Sarah, and we're not average."
Oh, wow.
That's a good standard. But yeah, so I mean, I was pro middle school. I don't think there was anything like.
What were some of your favorite things in middle school?
Oh gosh, burned CDs definitely.
Yeah, we're gonna
I mean,
get
that
into
was
that.
like right at the peak of that technology coming out, and I don't know, we probably like destroyed my buddy's computer like 4 times downloading music with viruses and stuff. So I feel like that, I mean, I don't know, that hanging out with friends, I was involved in, I don't know, normal kid stuff. I don't know,
I feel like there were probably more like commercial type things marketed towards middle school girls than maybe, I don't know. I don't have brothers, so I didn't grow up with any of that. Like we were very into, like, my sister and I into like Bath and Body Works. Like I had,
it's huge then.
I had the like it was like the glitter. Oh, there you go. It was like
it's gonna be a weekly tradition. We opening my can.
It was like the glitter roller ball that smelled like blueberry chemical or something. I look back and I'm like, why weren't my parents more concerned that I was like rolling glitter on my arms and things like that? It feels like it's not okay for a middle schooler, but you know.
And we were all way into girls in middle school. I mean, it was all about where the girls were, hanging out with the girls, calling the girls. This is pre-cell phone, pre-texting, obviously. I went to middle school in the early 90s. So we like would all of a sudden, like boys growing up, you hate going to the mall. Then all of a sudden middle school comes and we're suddenly cool with going to the mall. Not because we want to shop, but because we walk around with the girls for hours at a time.
We spent Friday night at the movies, had our parents drop us off. We'll be back at 9:30 to pick you up. And it's just like...
Yeah, so we would do that too. We'd leave the movie theater after our parents drove away, and we'd like go walk to Wendy's on Thomasville Road from the old Oak Lake 6 movie theater, which is now WCTV, I think.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy.
Yep.
Okay, so as everybody's middle school experience is not complete without some type of embarrassing or awkward moment, what was one of your most embarrassing or awkward moments of your teenage years?
Probably like my fashion choices if I looked back, and it would just be bad. I mean, I think that's true of anybody's time, but like I distinctly remember I went to this Y2K party.
Oh wow.
And
sorry.
When we all thought the world was ending.
Yeah. And
the last time.
For some reason I went to, if y'all remember the store in the mall, Gadzooks.
Oh, I for sure do.
Sure.
Like, why? I thought it was going to be a cool idea for this party to have silver pants. I do not know. But I have, like, silver pants. I had silver pants. They were
incredible.
ridiculous. That's kind of embarrassing looking back. And then there was one time I ran out of hair product back when I used that. And I only had, like, enough goop to, like, spike up the front of my head, but not the rest of it. And so I just had, like, this hard gelled spike front,
like a little lid,
and and then the rest of my hair. And I remember I got mercilessly shamed at school. So I went to the sink and I just had dry hair the rest of the day after I washed it out. But
Nice.
I don't know. There are probably worse things, but that's what I remember.
Dean, what about you?
Well, we had a lot more freedom back then, so like we could go a lot of places and just ride our bikes far places to go to friends' houses. I had my dad's like old 1970s bike. We called it the Green Machine, and it was that bad and that embarrassing. I don't know why I never got a new bike, but that was the bike I had. So everywhere we went, everybody had these like new bikes. I had my dad's Green Machine. that just comes to mind, just in all the things that just going to people's houses and parties, and I'd pull up on the bike, and I'm on the Green Machine.
And you're not old enough to be like, vintage is cool.
Yeah, not at all. Everyone's like, what is that thing?
I still actually have my dad's bike and ride it. But
I mean, for me, it was such a different era. I mean, like Y2K, I was in college. So middle school for me, it was just... we had just transitioned from cassette tapes to CDs, and not even fully. So it was kind of half and half, of like your music library or whatever at your house. It was about half and half. It was a different era. Browning jackets were really popular. Also starter jackets. I had a North Carolina starter jacket.
Yep.
It was a unique time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, both of you guys brought up burned CDs and mixtapes. So we're going to take it back for just a minute before we move into our deep dive. If you had to recall a playlist from your middle school years, if you had to run over to the boom box and hit record on the radio.
Time out. You didn't share your embarrassing middle school story. Nice try.
Just slip that right on in there. No, I actually do have one. Okay, mine isn't like, we were talking about this earlier. Mine isn't like I was embarrassed in front of a ton of people, but it does kind of capture the essence of like being a teenage girl. So the one that I can think of, I started middle school in Ohio, and then we moved to Tennessee. And so we lived in outside of Nashville in Williamson County, and I was going with my parents we went to an open house. We were like going to move into a different neighborhood or whatever. And so we were going around to these open houses, and I don't know, like I can't even remember why. I don't know if like something happened or I was just filled with lots of emotions as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old, but I was just in a mood. I was a very moody teenager, and it just all of a sudden, all the struggles that you have as a spoiled 13-year-old, right? Like all of, just life becomes too much, all the responsibilities riding on my shoulders. And so I found a bathroom in this house, and I sat down in the bathtub and like started crying. There's just like, I was like, I didn't even know why. I was just like crying. This is just like what it is to be a middle school girl. And my dad, of all people, found me. He wasn't even looking for me. He just like opened the door, sees me crying in the tub, and he's like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you crying?" And I was like, "I don't know. I have so many feelings." And so we just had this like weird, awkward like standoff, and then he left. And I think he just let me compose myself and leave. So I was like the weirdo. And then my parents were probably like, Okay, we need to like get out of this house that our daughter's crying in. We don't even know these
In the
people.
bathtub.
In the
I was
bathtub.
gonna say,
yeah.
the fact that you like I'm trying to imagine like climbing in the tub and just thinking
It was.
that's the right place
There
to have a
should've-
good cry.
There should have been music playing, and like it should have been raining outside or something.
I will say one other thing that comes to mind. My mom called the Coast Guard, at one point when I was in
wow.
middle school.
That's right. I love this story.
And this was super. I mean, it's still embarrassing. So I was with a friend and his mom and some of his mom's friends on a boat, and we had been gone all day, and we were coming back at like, I don't know, 9 o'clock at night, and we ran across a sandbar. I think we thought we were in the channel and we weren't. Whatever. We end up like, the boat's stuck. Like we just got to wait for the tide to come back in. And so I called my mom and I said, "Hey mom, I'm on a sandbar. I'm in a boat. We're fine. Everything's good." And she freaks out. Pat Scott has a tendency to think worst case scenario. And so there was a thunderstorm at her house, which meant there was a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico where we were, and, like whatever. So she ends up calling the Coast Guard, and they're like, "Ma'am, is he okay? Is everybody on the boat okay?" She's like, "Yeah, they're fine. Do they have food and water?" "Yeah." There's really nothing we can do. And so she's just left like in panic for 3 hours.
So the Coast Guard like refused to rescue you.
Yeah, I mean, because we didn't really need rescuing. We just needed the tide to come in. So
Coast Guard. Amazing.
We're like, we have better things to do.
About 4 hours later, the tide had come back in. There was enough water to float the boat, and we went home. And but my mom called the Coast Guard.
Almost
So
an international incident.
yeah, could have been.
All right. So what are these playlists? If you had a burn CD or a mixtape, what was on it?
So I'm of the era where country just kind of went pop, where like really country people listen to country, where you could like listen to country in Florida,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And Garth Brooks was the pioneer of that. I had this like big NBC concert that was a huge deal where he like crashed the guitars and he gave the famous extra verse to Friends in Low Places, and everyone in 1990, let's say 2-3, was crazy about Garth Brooks. So at least in my school where I lived, growing up in Northside Tallahassee. So that, and another thing that was, so a lot of Garth Brooks, Brooks and Dunn, things like that. Clay Walker was huge.
Oh, yeah.
I had a song called "If I Could Make a Living at 11 You" that was everywhere. And then R&B was very popular then. So like MTV, it's like all they play. They had a show called MTV Jams with Bill Bellamy that was on in the mornings, and I watched it all the time, especially during the summer. When I was home from school, I watched it during the summer, and it was like Boyz II Men, H-Town, Shy, Silk, like all these groups. SWV,
I only
which
recognize like one of those names.
SWV, which stands for Sisters with Voices, In Vogue. I mean, like it was just massive. It was a really big deal, but it was like his own huge mainstream like pop genre. So it's kind of two extremes, kind of like your country, which was more pop, it went from like Willie Nelson kind of stuff, or maybe like Randy Travis,
More
was
true
probably,
country.
yeah, more like that, to like actual like arena country was that
Yeah.
era. So that was kind of what I was mainly listening to. And of course, my favorite CD of all time from when I was in middle school is "Automatic for the People" by REM. Unrelated.
Yeah.
There you go.
I don't know. I mean, my musical taste is still all over the place. So my mixtape probably included like some, I don't know, pop punk, some 41 garbage,
Hence the gelled hair.
and Hoobastank or something. And then like Juvenile or, some just like terrible. I mean, and by terrible, I mean like it was good music, but not edifying in any way. Rap, and then just, I don't know, whatever, pop music. It would have been literally like, now that's what I call music, with some rap that wouldn't have been on the pop stations thrown in, like Country Grammar. I don't know.
Do you
Nelly.
remember the infomercials for the Now CDs where it was like 5 minutes long, but it was like, I'm going to sit here and watch this entire ad because I want to listen to all these songs?
Yes. You only got like 20 seconds of every fourth song, but yeah. And then, I mean, TRL, I remember like running home to watch TRL on MTV in the afternoon.
So I wasn't allowed to burn CDs. My mom like went on a campaign where she was like, that's not legit and we're not going to do that. And so I had to have my friends burn CDs, which even that, I was like a rule follower. And so even that, I was like, can I have a friend burn me a CD? Like, I was like so lame. But finally I got up the courage. And so one day I was like, I'm just going to do it. And so I downloaded LimeWire or whatever one of the services were. And we only had one computer. Our entire computer got a virus and crashed and had to be like completely restarted. So it was a traumatizing experience for sure.
And then the other big genre of my middle school was grunge.
Oh,
Had just come on the scene, which is like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, Green Day, those kind. They were considered like alternative and like almost like hard rock back then, which is kind of funny now.
Yeah.
But that was more the kids that wore like flannel shirts weren't what you wore in the fall back then. It was like you wore one unbuttoned with your your high Doc Martens, and you were viewed as like grungy, like mad at your dad kind of people. That was a thing too.
I was just straight up like what would be now like top 40. Like I was just like pop all the way. I actually pulled out today in honor of this episode my Now 6 CD.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at now like 55 or something this day and age. I don't even know. And it's probably a playlist. It's probably not a CD. But I was like, Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys. Lifehouse was really big. And that was kind of like I think they were one of those bands where you got to have the debate of like, they're not a Christian band. They're bands who are Christians. And I think really it was just like Way FM found a song that they could play that came from the mainstream.
That's totally
and so
what
they
it was.
did. I now looking back, I'm like, I think
all
this is
a
what
giant
this
marketing
was.
ploy.
Yeah, it wasn't like some cultural like new work. But
I feel like it was Lifehouse. There was, in middle school, and they came to our school. Those like, the drama groups from like probably, no offense, Dean Liberty or something that would like tour the country. And I feel like there was a Lifehouse song that was like,
oh, I'm sure,
super popular to one. And there was, this kind of dancing storytelling like about this kid who drinks and drives and then gets put in jail.
Yeah, we had that too. Yeah. I think I know what you're talking
Can't
about.
we do like Baptist College of Florida or something?
Okay,
does it have to be Liberty?
I mean, but yeah, lots of good pop music going on. I also, Dean, talking about the country music stuff, I was part of the era where I think it was like early 2000s where Shania Twain went through her country to pop transformation, and that was very controversial in our household because I had grown up on like Shania Twain country, which like she's from Canada anyways, and so I don't even know how country she ever was, but it was definitely a change for sure.
Yeah, I was not a fan of that transition.
Yeah,
Did that prepare you for the Taylor Swift transition?
Ooh.
Oh, maybe it
of
did.
country to pop.
Yes, that's why I was able to endure it a little better.
Because you have traveled to see Taylor Swift at Baton Rouge and Tiger Stadium and also in
Louisville, yeah.
She is a traveling Swiftie.
I spent more time in football stadiums watching Taylor Swift than I probably have college football games.
That is a fact.
At least in the last like 8 years or so. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and move on into our deep dive and just talk about the growing pains of quote-unquote teenage church. And by that, we just mean a church that has kind of emerged out of the plant phase. They're maybe self-sustaining and are starting to put some systems and structures in place that, kind of pave the way for long-term ministry. But you're also not at the place where you have the resources in terms of finances and people and facilities and all of those things that a long-term established church does have. And so just going to kind of talk about the different, unique facets of that life phase of a church. And that's what we're in as a church. Let's see, in August, we will be 13 years old as a church.
13 years. That's
all right.
wild.
So smells like Teen Spirit.
That's right.
But so kind of just to start, I want to ask you guys, like, what are some of the unique challenges or growing pains that churches face as they are growing out of the plant phase?
One of the first things that come to mind for me is the expectations. Once you grow and have more people, are expectations you would have on a church that's been around for 75 years with generational infrastructure, endowments, paid off buildings, all of these type of things, that the expectations from people on a teenage church or on those of like mature, by mature I mean like in existence, like older, I don't mean age, just like long time established churches. And you might say, well, it's been 13 years, shouldn't you be established by now? And for a church, yes, we are established, but at the same time, we don't have those endowments everywhere and loyalty of 4 generations that no matter what happens, they're still going to go to this church and those kind of things, that it really takes like decades of how we do youth ministry and how you do groups and Sunday school. So a lot of what we're still doing is new. We're still trying stuff, and I hope we're still trying stuff when we're 50 years old as a church. But we're still trying stuff out, and we're trying to get to things. Like, it's impossible to do every single thing that someone thinks a church should do all at once. We don't have a ministry for every single thing. I don't know if we ever will. I don't want to have one for everything. But at the same time, the expectation can be there. Whereas a church plant, often you're just sort of given a mulligan all the time because they're just new and they're in a school or they're those type of things, and it's just they just started and there's only 30 of them, that type of deal. Once it grows, people expect you to function like you've been around forever, when in reality you haven't.
Yeah, your programming has to kind of mirror and match the expectations of other churches in your context or in your city. So if every other church has a youth ministry, then you are expected to have a youth ministry.
I think of our friend Jarrett Stevens at Prestonwood. He just had his 20th anniversary on staff.
That's awesome.
Our church is 13 years old.
Right.
And Jarrett's not old. And he's had his 20th anniversary on staff at Prestonwood. You know how many people at Prestonwood have been on staff for 30 years and 40 years and that kind of thing? Our church, so Jarrett, who's early 40s, has been on staff significantly longer at his church than we've existed as a church.
Right.
That's an example of that. So we're transitioning people regularly and those type of things.
And I think too, in that, like, you have the growing pains of moving systems that support that ministry along. So as a church plant, you're just kind of like, okay, we got to survive. Like, what does like next week look like, let alone, when you're a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old church, you're not really thinking 10 years down the road. Like, there's not this giant master plan necessarily. It's there's a vision obviously, but it's let's survive. And so, and then you start something and it's fine. It works, but your systems maybe are not where the expectations of people are. And so, and even if you have a ministry, it may not be as well formed as, that ministry is at a church that's been around for 10 or 15 years doing, whatever ministry that might be. And so the growing pain there becomes kind of pulling people into new systems and while also matching the expectations and trying to shift from, sort of flying by the seat of your pants, leading, or operating kind of from the gut or from the way that we've always done it, and growing into more mature systems with more oversight and better structure and more accountability and oftentimes more efficiency too, that allows, more sustained ministry. But you don't have, all of that in place. And, there's, I think, a trickle-down effects like facilities and staff and, all that.
Yeah, I think about when, so Alex, you and I are in the, what is it, strategic learning community? Is that what it's called?
Strategic leadership community or learning community. Yeah, I forget. I don't know.
SLC with Lifeway. And we were at the last cohort meeting, well, the only cohort meeting that we've been able to gather with because of COVID, boo. But I remember we were at a working lunch, and one of the girls was asking about, being at a larger, more established church, and kind of talking about structuring like human resources and some type of, or some internal kind of systems and structures, and how a larger church can do that, and some decisions that you have to make and things like that. And after, I think she was asking Kevin Peck, and after he answered her, I just remember being like, what if you don't have an HR department? like what if your executive assistant is the HR person? What do you do then? And he was like, yeah, you guys are right there in that spot where, yeah. And so I think they're just, it's difficult to sometimes, or it's tempting to look out and see, okay, what are these churches that really in a lot of ways internally run the quote unquote business and like the functions of their operations in the way that like a large corporation does if you are not there, because things tend to just fit in nice, neat places, I think, more easily. Not that they're not having to make decisions and weigh things, like change is happening behind the scenes all the time. But I think for a church that's kind of trying to grow into that, you're not running things off of like sticky notes, and emails anymore, but you are not quite at the place where you have the people or the positions. And so you really kind of have to, I think you have to really pay close attention and be really intentional with, I know we feel like the weight of trying to put the resources to the most important things, and that those are hard decisions, especially when you are still kind of trying to figure out like what you want to do and like what the next few years are going to look like. And it's you want to gravitate towards sort of that like just traditional model of like, well, this is what you would do, or this is how you would structure an HR team or a campus team or whatever, but you might not have the people or you might not have the money. And so you sort of have to live in the tension of piecing things together while also trying to keep some semblance of organization. And that can be really tricky.
Oh yeah. I remember when I was at First Baptist as a youth minister, it was every ministry area had a full-time secretary when I was there. I mean, like every ministry area, like the singles ministry had a secretary. It was like everything. I never had to set anything up. You know, if I needed to have chairs out for a youth event, I would just fill out a form and put it in the mailbox of the full-time multiple-person maintenance staff, and then it would be set up like that. I didn't have to worry about picking it up. I'd have to take out trash. Like none of those kind of things. Our staff has to do that every day. Those type of things, like our ministry staff. And this is just for perspective, just the difference in a long time established church versus one that's a teenage church. Our church is larger than First Baptist in terms of people who come here. I mean that in a competition kind of way. We love First Baptist. I mean, just like for perspective, yet they have all those kind of things because there's expectations, there's the way they do things, the way it functions. So even though we have, I would say, significantly more people than First Baptist does on a Sunday currently, not including COVID, but pre-COVID, there is. Again, I don't mean this. I'm going to get a disclaimer. I don't mean this like in a kind of weird way, but just for perspective, the difference in an established. To give you a literal example of an established church in this. So, like for example, we have met in 17 different locations. I think it is since our church first started. If you're a Faith Presbyterian on Meridian Road has not met in 17 different locations. They've been there for a long, long, long time. So we have this great building on Sessions Road. We've been here less than 5 years. I don't know how long we've been here. How long we've been here?
4 years.
4 years. Yeah. So we've been in our first permanent, really like that we own location for 4 years.
Yeah.
So even though that's just gives some perspective on just the differences in how these churches function and operate.
Yeah, and it's easy to lose perspective of that because, and I think that's a challenge that growing churches have to really fight, is the temptation to feel jealous or to say, man, our ministry would be so much easier if we had those things. And it's like, well, that if you look at the things that a lot of established churches are able to do, we should say, like, praise God that they have those resources and that they're, we can learn from them. And you have to, I think sometimes you have to fight the temptation to think, well, if I had, a ministry assistant or if I had this or that, all of a sudden I would be able to do ministry the way that I want to do it. And that's, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to reach people. And I don't mean that in like just a, nice tie a nice neat bow on it, but it really, it's easy to focus on those things and think, okay, I'm dependent on those things to do ministry. And we know that there is no, the way that an established church is operating versus the way that growing church versus a church plant, like we're all just in different life phases. So there isn't, competition. And so I think that's something that, growing churches really have to, I know we've had to have a lot of those conversations, of like, okay, yeah, it would be nice to have some more of these resources, but they are resources, they support you, but they don't necessarily enable the work. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in that too, Ashlyn, to your point about resources, like one of the biggest, issues that we've had as a growing church is that we've always had a desire to do more ministry than we've actually had the capacity to be able to accomplish, for whatever, oftentimes that's financial. It's not always financial, but and so that's a struggle, for a growing church that you oftentimes, Dean, like you mentioned, every ministry area had a secretary. Well, like it's like for us, there have been it's like, are we going to hire this for this ministry this year or that ministry? Not like the third, fourth, fifth person in a ministry, but are we going to hire a person to try and tackle this one thing that we want to do? And so, that balance of, we've, by the Lord's grace, seen our church grow in generosity every year in amazing ways. And, but there's that tension always. And I don't think it's unique to the church plant phase or to the teenage church phase, but like the resources are limited. And so it's always a challenge for the established church. It may be in some ways less so because most of their ministries are set up, most of their ministries are running, and it's a matter of oftentimes resource allocation. But there's always the desire to do more. And so, there's just things that are in some sense easier when you have the funds to be able to do it and to put behind it, to resource it well. And so that's definitely a big challenge, I think, that we face, where we look at churches maybe that are more established, that are ahead of us, where we kind of feel like, oh, we're out of this church plant phase. We should be able to do X, Y, or Z with our ministry, but we can't because of the, just the decisions and the things that we have to say yes to and the things that we choose to say no to keep ministry kind of operational.
Yeah, and those who like really just love and thrive, they love structure and thrive off structure, are going to be a little frustrated in the teenage years because it's not a cop-out. You do oftentimes have to build and evaluate and analyze and take away and add as you go. Remember, New Spring Church told us we really kind of first planted early on. We were meeting with some of their people up in Anderson, South Carolina, and they said they only did 6-month budgets at the time because they had no idea what their church was going to look like 6 months from now. That doesn't really happen in an established church unless some kind of catastrophe happens. So you get a pretty good idea of what you're going to look like. It doesn't mean you're not growing and things like that, but you have an idea of how this church functions and works, what it's going to look like. But in a teenage church, a church plant, you're just like praying and hoping and just excited because someone new showed up. A teenage church is a really interesting transition because you don't know what 6 months is going to look like. So you do have to have, it's not an excuse, it's just you're going to need to be flexible, and you're going to need to have a lot of grace, and you're going to need to be able to roll and move on the fly, to put some kind of system into place that 3 months ago you didn't even know you needed necessarily. So some of the unique stuff that is fun too, but it can really drive you crazy if you're really somebody who thrives off of structure. So you have to, so that person out there, I would say, well, then we need your structure, those skills. Please bring them to the table, and please realize that it's going to take some patience to put it all into play, because again, we didn't know this was even how our church looked, 6 months ago, and all of a sudden now there's this need that's become aware, or this strategic shift, or all those things that happen often in a teenage church.
What are some of the unique maybe opportunities that churches our size, our age, have as they're growing? We kind of talk about some of the challenges, but what are some of the ways that churches, as they grow out of the plant phase and become more established, what does it look like to flourish in that phase when it does feel like you're having to make such big decisions and things can, change from month to month and things like that? What are some ways that churches can really enjoy this time?
I think there's lots of things to celebrate, and I hope every church has these. That's my hope for every church. But with there being so much change happening rapidly all the time, it just allows a lot of cool things to take place that you can be excited about, and you can celebrate. That comes to mind quickly. We have a lot of things that just get pumped about, around here, which I hope it's always that way. But this phase right now is fun for those type of things. There's opportunities for leadership development, to take people and put them into roles they never maybe thought they had the capacity to do, because established church is more, go to the churchjobs.com site, look at the resume, seminary degrees, credentials, all those kind of things, where a lot of times a teenage church is taking people from the family and putting them in positions to lead. That's just neat to me. And that comes with being green, and it comes with, a learning curve and some frustrations probably sometimes, people feeling inadequate, those type of things. When people realize they're not and they can't do this, it's pretty incredible. And then sending comes to mind as well, because there can be that missional impulse is still there from being a church plant. There's still that excitement about reaching, going, doing these type of things. And the great established churches, usually what's allowed them to be effective still is they've never lost that spirit, but teenage years, I think it comes more naturally because you're not far removed. People remember when you were a plant. They remember the first person that got baptized or the 10th person and those type of things. And that's just some things that come to mind when I think about it.
Yeah, I think, Dean, you talked about a lot of change, and that actually provides a lot of flexibility. So, in a traditional church, there's a lot of we've always done it this way, or there's sort of these, these golden calf kind of, ministries or services or things that they do and they provide that just because they haven't been around as long, the teenage church maybe doesn't cling to in a way. Obviously, leading change is never easy, but when something's only been around for 3 or 4 years as opposed to 30 or 40, it's just different. You have more flexibility, and people adapt to that pretty quickly. I just think of our staff. We have multiple people, Ashlyn, you and I included, who over the course of our time on staff have filled multiple roles. Right. So we've got people who've filled 3 or 4 different roles on our staff, and they, as they kind of have flexed and changed and moved from role to role, that actually helps kind of create a culture of change in our church, and so nobody holds anything too tightly, which I think is just helpful for as we kind of figure out and pivot and say, oh, this was working really well, we're going to kind of put more energy into that, or this wasn't working as well, we're going to actually kind of move away from that as a strategy or as a ministry or something. You just don't have to deal with that. You don't have the awkward kind of conversation of Miss Betty, who's who's sat at the front desk for 35 years, and you're like, Miss Betty's really like not the best way for us to like allocate resource. But who wants to fire Miss Betty, And so, like, that's it.
Alex is going.
Alex.
No, I don't want to touch that. But but you don't have those, you don't have those kind of golden calf positions. I mean, I heard of a church recently who, in the midst of all this COVID stuff, they fired a full-time staff member whose only job was death notices to the congregation, and it's just like,
wow.
I mean, that's just different,
Like, writing to the church that someone in the congregation
that's the way
passed away.
That's the way I understand it. Yeah.
Wow.
And granted, I'm sure that was a role that.
What a depressing job. Important, I guess.
Yeah.
But
hopefully she gets birth announcements too, maybe.
Yeah,
but
for real.
but yeah, it was like just kind of this thing that just had always been there, and somebody had to make a tough decision, And so, like, those kind of things, that's an opportunity. That's a blessing of the season that we're in. You can shift and move and not be tied to that thing too much.
And I think we said about not holding things too tightly, and I think that's a challenge for established church pastors too, and I'm not sure when we become, maybe people might be listening to us going, you are an established church. Well, we're only 13 years old, so it might look like that to the outside, but for a church that's actually really young, especially with all the transition we've had over the years of people moving, and we lose people all the time from our church, not because they're mad, but because they move. So that's been interesting, but just the established churches that can lead through that about what we hold tightly and what we don't I think are churches that are going to continue to thrive. And so, like, for example, if I became the pastor and took a position at a church tomorrow that was a very established church, there would be things that I inherited, whether I liked it or not. And it was going to be, here you go, and good luck, buddy. Now you're allowed to have change, but it would take a long time to be able to establish that. But the person that replaced me here, yeah, they'd have some things they inherited, of course, the way we do things, but there'd be a lot of room to be able to implement and do different kind of things and to have a different approach. And that's one of the great things about being a teenage church, is that flexibility is still there.
Yeah.
Something that I've found that is encouraging, I think, for this phase of our church is that even though there are a lot of unknowns and you're really trying to, figure a lot of things out, now there's so many resources and conferences and, all kinds of things provided to you in terms of leadership and how your church is going to operate and, ministry support and all these things. And I actually feel like the older that we get, the more helpful that stuff actually becomes, because I remember going to conferences when, I had first come on staff and the church was like 3 years old, and not that things weren't helpful, but I just remember leaving and always feeling so like fire hosed, like how do you even, and we would get in the car and talk about things, and it's like everything was so big and theoretical, and yet so much of it it felt so hard to actually grab onto tangible things that we could actually apply, because I felt like a lot of times the conversation came back to, well, how do we scale that? How do we do that when we don't have, a $20 million budget and, all these kinds of things? And that's so like that is not the norm for a church to have those kinds of resources. So like also acknowledging that, but something that has been encouraging is that I think as we've grown, you do have to kind of go through a season where you just do it. Like you just do the ministry, and you can't, you just get off the blogs and don't go to every conference and sort of disengage from some of that stuff and actually figure out like what kind of work you're doing. And then it becomes so helpful to look at some of those resources and say, okay, we've built some things that now we can stand on and look at and see, like, does this apply? Is this helpful? Or do we need to look elsewhere for guidance or for support and resources? And so that's been something that I think churches who maybe feel the tension of these growing pains can be encouraged by and remember is the further that you go and the more you continue to work on some of these things, the more I think insight you're going to have, just because you have experience to apply some of these resources and all the resources that are available to growing churches. To me, that becomes easier to sort of filter and decipher what is helpful for your church. And you can, of course, some things are always going to feel like they're out of reach or they don't apply to you. That's true for any church, but it's just been exciting to be able to have some of these bigger picture conversations and actually feel like, okay, these are things that we're going to do or that do apply to us, and see how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I think too, the other thing, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but you get the opportunity really to build whatever you're working on from the ground up in a lot of ways, and so we went from one staff member, Dean, to now we have 24 people on our payroll, and so we've had the opportunity to build and shape and nurture our staff culture, and that's been really fun. Like that, talk about something like you didn't inherit it, you built it, and so like there's in regards to kind of a lot of different organizational areas, you have that opportunity to really build things into what you want. So you can look at outside organizations and say, I like that, I don't like that, or that's a really neat, ministry opportunity. I think we may try and, see what it would look like to implement something like that for our church in our context. And you have the opportunity to build it, which is not everybody's favorite thing, but to provide structure to those things that, as you age, that you get to help build and see and shape. And that's just, I think that's been fun for me as we've kind of walked through this.
Yeah, I think it's important to enjoy those moments, as much as they can frustrate sometimes, is to enjoy and be grateful for it. Because right now, being a teenage church, you don't stay there. So if we're 26 years old as a church and are still acting like we're 13, that's going to be a problem, right? So right now, the same way when you're a teenager and you get braces for the first time to get your teeth straight, right? There's things you're doing now to get yourself kind of ready for the next phases of life. And so for us now, a lot of our behind-the-scenes conversations right now are trying to put the right structures in place and able to be a church that is 26 years old, or even 20 years old. As we see from elders conversations to things that are happening right now are to get all that right and get it where it needs to go forward. Like it's okay to be a teenager, and we have to give ourselves grace in the fact that we are just a teenager. We have to remind ourselves of that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And in a young teenager, only 13, we're not 18. But at the same time, you don't stay a teenager. You have to be able to grow and to adjust and to build and to lead through those years to become an adult.
One more question before we kind of wrap this up and head into our local on tap segment. As we think about, Alex, you mentioned staff culture and what that has to look like as churches grow and change. What are some of the differences that you guys have seen from City Church specifically as we have grown up, and maybe, true for other churches of our size and comparison as well? What are things that people need to know about how specifically leading and managing your staff has to change and adapt as you grow?
I mean, some of it I think is like you just grow up, and so we have always had a pretty flexible culture in terms of, office hours and things like that. There's the emphasis is more on getting the work done than it is being in the office from a certain time to a certain time. And so, but with that that's easy to manage when there's 3 or 4 people. It's a lot harder to manage and clarify and communicate expectations when you're, 20 plus staff members. And so, I mean, a lot of it is just kind of tightening up, while also retaining a lot of the things that sort of made being a staff of 8 to 10, enjoyable. And so I think something that we've really tried to cultivate is that sort of familial kind of atmosphere, even in serious moments. And so sharing, we do a staff chapel once a month that includes lunch, like just sitting down over food and having good conversation with friends is really important. And so it's like you can bring the policy about spending and be taken seriously, and also like have fun and joke around about, stuff over the lunch table, and kind of creating that balance of shaping the culture. But in that, you have to have the spending policy. You have to have, you have to have a clear vacation policy. Like a lot of the HR kind of stuff that just as that grows, you have to be able to do that and to tighten up while also trying to maintain a lot of those things that make the working culture what it is. That would be kind of my quick thought.
Yeah, well, one thing I appreciate about Doug Dortch, who was pastor at First Baptist, I appreciate a lot of things about him, actually. A great person, did a lot for me personally. But one thing he used to say that I repeat to this day is he used to say things like, you can't grow youth ministry in the office. He expected them to. Like, there's established churches out there where you have to be in at 8:30 and you have to stay till 5. Like, it's a thing, like it really is. And that might make sense for a ministry assistant who's behind a computer all day doing, kind of legal or clerical work. But that doesn't make much sense for somebody who's trying to go reach teenagers or go and reach college students, So again, I think it's building the systems. I think it's high expectations and high trust. Mm-hmm. You have to have both those things, and really keeping it still where you're approachable. So, you are so approachable as a church planter because there's 50 of you. When you become 1,500 plus, 2,000 plus, 3,000 plus, wherever you are, your flow is going to change. You can't be available to everyone. That's impossible. But at the same time, the only time the church should see you is not right when you come out on stage to preach.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of that happens. So I think keeping those cultural things is really important while elevating expectations that we don't act like we're 5 years old anymore.
Yeah.
We act like, I'll say things to my youngest. I'll say, hey, you're not 3 anymore. You're 5 now.
Yep.
I'll say those things to her. Like, I have different expectations of you at 5. I don't expect you to be 9, but I expect you to be 5.
Yep. Yeah.
That's good. I think we also have to remember too that, as the staff kind of spreads out into their ministry areas, like we talk a lot about not wanting people to be siloed or to feel siloed, and so there's a lot of communication that happens with that we're constantly working on. But also I think it's interesting how, like, something that I see, which I actually think this is cool, and if you channel it the right way, it can serve you really well, that in the beginning when there's 3, 4, or even 10 of you, I think it's easier to all be on the same page about what you're working on and where you're headed and why decisions are made, and everybody feels really in the loop. But as that just inevitably spreads out, it's really hard to help people feel like they still have a say, or that they understand. Everybody is looking at the, to use a business term, the organization, the kind of internal workings from a different angle. And so, if you are looking at, 10, Dean, if you're at 30,000 feet and we're maybe at 10 or 15,000 feet, and then, somebody else is on the ground, or at 2,000 feet or something, you really have to try hard to communicate with people and to keep that in mind so that they feel a part of that. And also at the same time sort of acknowledge, Alex, to your point, at the end of the day, some of these things do have to be put in place or do have to happen. But the thing that's cool that I have seen is that the longer that people are on staff and are in their roles, we all kind of start to develop our own ministry philosophy, and that can be really dangerous. That can be divisive if you don't flesh some things out and talk about why people see things the way that they do and what they bring to the table. There does have to be some sort of unity, right? And I don't just mean unity around the gospel, but there has to be some sort of unity around why you do the things that you do and stuff like that, and the direction that you're heading. But I think you can also channel that because, people, it shifts from, okay, we're all part of this, what feels like a movement, to all of a sudden now, I carry this responsibility and I have, my own opinions and thoughts about the way that things work. And I think that's cool to see, in, if our kids team, comes up with an idea and they're to see something grow from an idea or a concept into actually happening and putting it in place, and knowing that, you didn't just walk in and say, here's this fully baked idea that I'm giving to you to go do it. They actually came up with that out of the way that they are seeing ministry needs and what needs to be done, and then meeting that need and, empowering people to be a part of that and leading. It's just neat, I think, to see that. And you do have to do a good job of, I think, guiding and channeling all of that energy, but it can be really cool to see how things can pop up and grow, and you almost sit back and think I had nothing to do with this, this thing over here happened and it's awesome. I think about Hunter, relaunching our college ministry, Hunter, our college director. So yeah, I think that can be a really neat thing that growing churches can get to watch more closely, just because you are still close enough to everything that's happening, but you're starting to disconnect from some things, or just having to things sort of start to fit into their respective places. And so that is just an interesting process. So all right, so let's move on to Local on Tap before we wrap up. So we're going to go back to the kind of middle school theme and talk about local Tallahassee life. And so if you were going to design a field trip for middle schoolers in Tallahassee, what would your day look like for those students? Dean, what about you?
Sit Indian style in the parking lot and stare at Leon High School?
Oh my God.
Maybe, no. Well, kind of. Yeah. A middle school, that's a cool question. What would a middle school field trip look like? I would most likely, I would want, as hard middle school, I want them to get it and be cool with it. So like the disclaimer is they're cool with it. Like they all have good attitudes and they're
They've
like
all bought into your
yeah,
vision.
they've all bought in. They're not complaining and they don't think it's boring. Like I want to walk them through just like the not state of Florida history. I want them, which matters, but I want them to see local Tallahassee history. So I want them to go to like the Grove Museum.
That'd be cool.
I want them to go to Cascades Park and walk around and read all the signs around the entire place. To the Knott House where the Emancipation Proclamation was read. So that's what I want them to as a local. I do want them to go to Leon and walk through the oldest high school in the state of Florida. That matters to our city. So I want that. So I would want them to do as much Tallahassee local, learn the city and the history of our city as much as they possibly can that day, including where they're going to eat lunch and all those type of things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with that. I don't have a big major difference. I would say though the state capitol is here, so we can do some Florida history, and the 22nd floor of the Capitol is like the best view of the city in my opinion. So I think that has to be included.
And doesn't every middle schooler have like an iPhone where they can take cool trendy pictures?
Yeah,
up there,
I'm sure they can
This is true.
take a panoramic and get the whole thing in and put the right filter on it and all that, or do some TikTok dance up there or whatever it is that they do now. But yeah, 22nd floor of the Capitol I think has to be on the agenda somewhere.
Nice. I had the Historic Capitol Museum. So our middle schoolers are getting a lot of museum time, which I would have loved. I don't know that every middle schooler would love, but that's right up my alley. But at the Historic Capitol Museum, where I, fun fact, volunteered in college, you can do a mock legislative session in the house, the replica of the House chambers. So again, if this tells you anything about how cool I was in middle school, this is something that I'm recommending. But I think
this
it's
why you
cool.
were crying in a bathtub at an open house?
Maybe there's unrest in my soul about some type of historical moment or something. But then you could go to the St. John's Cemetery. I think it's the St. John's Cemetery. Is that where Prince Murat
That is where Prince is
buried?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte is buried in a cemetery in Tallahassee, which, you'd have to go through a whole nother history lesson for them to even be know what that is. So that could turn in middle schoolers in a cemetery could go really bad really fast.
And his old house is next to the Tallahassee Museum.
Yeah.
We call it the Junior Museum. People my age from Tallahassee, sure. But it's there. One more thing I would do is I would have them drive just across the border on the way to Cairo, but kind of in unincorporated nowhere, to see the house where Jackie Robinson was born.
Yep.
There you go.
There's just all that's left is the chimney because it burned down. And there's a historical marker of where Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball was born.
Nice.
Yeah.
My end of the day activity, see, this is I'm showing that I can have some fun. They could go zip lining at the Junior Museum.
Look at you.
It's a tree-to-tree
That'd be
adventures. I can be fun too.
I thought you were going to say Greenway.
It comes up every podcast
You can go
episode.
frolic on the Greenway with Ashlyn and her dog.
Okay, true story. When Family Church, who they're in West Palm Beach, they were going to come up and help us with some Easter promo and stuff, and we had this big planning session about what to help or what to let them do around town and that kind of stuff. And my great suggestion was, let's all go to a Greenway and have a picnic. And everybody was like, middle schoolers and high schoolers are not going to want to go to, what do you do? Just go and stand there. So I'm not a good, don't ask me to plan the day for your middle schooler.
Yeah. Nobody's having me on their field trip planning committee anytime soon.
All right. Well, it has been a great episode. Thanks so much for listening. We'd love for you to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a review. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks for listening to The Local Dive.
Thanks for listening to The Local Dive, a podcast diving into deep and shallow musings about Christ, the church, and culture. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow The Local Dive on social media and continue the conversation with us on Instagram and Twitter at The Local Dive Pod.